She stood at the edge of the training ground with her posture straight and her eyes forward, her uniform crisp, despite the long day that had passed. The sun was lowering in the sky, casting a fiery glow over the compound, and every Navy SEAL trainee was exhausted to the bone, but she remained silent and composed. Her presence was a mystery to everyone around her because no one knew how someone so calm and so quiet had managed to secure a spot among the toughest warriors in the world. She had said nothing about her past, and she seemed to avoid any attention, though attention always found her anyway because silence can be louder than any boast, and a wound can speak without a single word. Her name was Alexandra Reed, but the other candidates only knew her as Reed. She spoke when she needed to during tactical drills, during navigation exercises, during weapons handling, but never more than the bare minimum. She did everything perfectly, following instructions precisely and never asking for clarification, as if she already knew every detail before it left the instructor's lips. The others watched her with curiosity and a touch of unease, because while they struggled, she seemed to already understand the pain and the hardship of war, and it did not scare her. It was as if she had already lived through the worst battles imaginable, and this training was merely a shadow of something darker that once consumed her life. The instructors noticed her too. They were trained to pick apart weaknesses, to find the cracks in armor and break a recruit down until either the recruit rebuilt themselves stronger or left shattered forever. But with Reed, there was no visible crack, no anger, no panic, no sign of fear, even when they pushed her harder than the rest. Even when the blow of each command hit like a hammer on steel, she accepted every challenge with unwavering resolve. She did not celebrate when she succeeded, and she did not mourn when she stumbled once because it never happened. Again, she kept moving forward, silent like a ghost among the living. The other trainees whispered among themselves, each crafting their own theories. Some thought she was the daughter of a high-ranking officer given a chance to prove her worth. Others believed she was running from something desperate, clinging to the SEALs as her path to redemption. But then there were the ones who wondered if she had already killed before, if she bore the weight of memories that none of them could imagine, because there was a shadow in her eyes that appeared whenever someone mentioned real combat or when they trained with live rounds. She would freeze for a fraction of a second, not in fear, but as though her soul had left her body and returned from somewhere, far away. The whispers grew louder, especially after Hell Week began, when the ocean swallowed every weakness a human could hold. The freezing water clawed at their skin, and the instructors barked their orders as waves crashed over them. Everyone coughed, and choked and shivered violently, but Reed faced the sea head-on. She did not break even when her lips turned blue, even when her muscles felt like they were tearing apart from exhaustion. She kept going as if she had faced colder waters, darker nights and harsher battles than any of them could comprehend, at night when the others lay collapsed in the sand, praying for a minute of rest. Reed always stared toward the horizon as though she was waiting for something or someone. The moonlight illuminated the faint scar that traced down her cheek, a scar no one dared to ask about. A silent question hung in the air. Who had she been before all of this? And what had she survived to become so unshakable? One evening, during a rare moment of quiet, the instructors called for medical checks. Every recruit stepped forward, removing gear and lifting sleeves for body inspections. The corpsmen worked quickly, cataloging bruises, fatigue, and dehydration. All normal things for SEAL candidates. Then it was Reed's turn. She stood silently, letting the corpsman examine her arms, and then her torso and back. When her shirt came off, everyone around her fell silent. Every eye widened, and every breath froze in mid-air, jagged lines carved across. Her body like a map of violence, deep wounds that once threatened her life, and scars that looked like they were made not by accidents or training mishaps, but by knives, bullets, and shrapnel. Her back bore the mark of burns and whipping wounds her ribcage etched with the memory of impact trauma, and her left shoulder showed a deep surgical scar as if a bullet had been removed from bone. The corpsman froze, shocked for a moment before forcing himself to continue the exam. But the silence from the trainees was deafening. No one knew how to react because these were not scars from someone preparing for war. They were from someone who had already faced it, someone who had lived through something brutal, unforgiving and relentless. Her body told the story. She refused to speak. A story that made every man around her suddenly question their own strength and their understanding of pain. She did not brag. She did not tremble. She simply pulled her shirt back on and stepped into position, as though nothing happened. From that moment, every trainee looked at Reed differently. The fear and curiosity mixed into something heavier. Respect, perhaps, or intimidation, because she had suffered more than any of them, yet she still stood on the same ground and passed every test they faced without complaint. The instructors exchanged glances, too. There were things about her they had not been told, things they now needed to know. One instructor, a lieutenant commander with years of classified operations behind him, approached the files that night looking for answers, but her record was sealed. Every detail about her previous service, every transfer, every deployment was blacked out, as if someone high up wanted her past buried forever. Only clear line in the file was the reason for her discharge from her former unit wounded in action. But those words did not cover the horrors etched into her skin. The next day, during a tactical drill, the team simulated a hostage rescue scenario. Reed took command without being asked. She moved with precision, leading each step with an instinct honed by real battlefield chaos. She anticipated the instructors' traps and countered them before they unfolded. She navigated the mock buildings like she had cleared real enemy strongholds in the dead of night. Her rifle never wavered, and her breathing never changed. And when the scenario ended, she had saved every simulated hostage without losing a single teammate. The instructors exchanged that, knowing. Look again, the others stared, not daring to question the truth they now suspected. After the drill, while the group gathered for debriefing, one of the loudest and most confident recruits, a man who always cracked jokes to hide his fear, stepped too close to Reed. He pointed at one of the faded scars barely visible beneath her gear, and with a nervous laugh asked, "So what did this one come from?" The joke died in his throat when Reed simply looked at him. Her eyes were darker than the ocean. They had nearly drowned in the night before. And there was something ancient in that stare, something that made every hair on his neck stand straight. She did not speak not a single word, but in that silence, he understood that whatever story created, that scar was not a story he ever wanted to hear. He stepped back immediately, swallowing hard, and Reed walked away without a sound. Her silence became the loudest force in training. They all felt it. Every candidate, every instructor. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind rattled the barracks and nightmares chased the tired minds of those young warriors. They wondered what nightmares haunted her. How deep her pain must go to have shaped someone who no longer flinched at the chaos around her. But the truth was that Reed did not sleep easily. Her mind drifted back to a battlefield she could not forget, to faces she could not save, to screams she could not silence. Her past was not a place she wanted to remember, but it refused to let her go, haunting her every breath, every heartbeat, every moment she stood under the sun pretending to be whole. She had come here for a reason, though a purpose she clung to with every step she took, because she believed that if she could survive this, if she could earn the right to wear the trident, maybe she could finally put the ghosts of her past to rest. Maybe she could find redemption on the other side of pain. But the past has a way of returning, and soon every SEAL would learn that her silence was not stubbornness or pride. It was the final barrier holding back memories so dark that when revealed, they would stop every SEAL cold because none of them were prepared for the truth about her combat. passed. The following morning dawned gray and, heavy with the kind of silence that precedes storms, Reed arrived at the training grounds before anyone else. Her boots sank slightly into the wet sand, and the air smelled of salt and oil from the sea training exercises that had begun hours before. Sunrise. The others trickled in slowly, rubbing their eyes and murmuring complaints about fatigue and cold, but Reed remained steady, her face expressionless and her mind focused on what she had come to do. She did not speak to anyone, preferring to stay in the shadows, observing the way the group moved like predators in formation or chaos, depending on who led them. The instructors had devised a new exercise, a navigation challenge through the cliffs and rocky coves that jutted along the coastline. It was dangerous even for experienced SEALs because one false step could result in broken bones. Or worse, a team had to follow a series of markers and signals while avoiding traps placed deliberately by the instructors, and the clock ticked relentlessly. The others were tense, anxious, and visibly shaken by the thought of falling or failing, but Reed moved forward like a shadow slipping over stone, careful, precise, aware of every detail and every risk. Halfway through the exercise, one of the newer recruits lost footing and tumbled down a small ledge, scraping his arm and twisting his ankle. His screams echoed against the cliffs as the instructors barked orders. The others hesitated, uncertain how. To proceed, Reed did not hesitate. She dropped her pack, laid it across the ledge to stabilize him, and began issuing calm directions that seemed to come from a place no one could see, but everyone instinctively obeyed. She anchored a rope secured his harness and helped him climb back up, and not a single second was wasted. Her hands were steady and strong, and every movement carried a confidence that unnerved the young men around her. When they finally reached the next checkpoint, everyone was gasping for air, covered in cuts and bruises and trembling with adrenaline. But Reed appeared untouched. The instructors gathered the group for a debriefing, and one of them, a grizzled veteran of multiple deployments, narrowed his eyes at Reed and asked how she remained so composed when the team nearly lost a recruit. She simply shrugged and replied nothing, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. The murmurs among the trainees grew louder after that day, because it was not just her skill or her calm, it was something deeper, something almost unnatural. They began to notice small details about her that they had missed before. The way she seemed to sense danger before it arrived, the way she read the terrain as if it were a map she had memorized long ago, the way she carried herself with a patience that seemed beyond human. And always there was the silence that carried the weight of everything she had survived. That night the barracks were colder than usual. A thin fog had rolled in from the ocean and the windows rattled against the wind. Reed lay on her cot, awake, listening to the others snore fitfully and mutter dreams she did not dare to imagine. She thought about the mission that had left. Her scarred and broken the mission that had stolen friends and burned away innocence. Her hands traced the faint ridges across her body, and she felt the pull of memory like a chain, pulling her back into a nightmare she had promised herself she would never revisit. She had been leading a small reconnaissance team behind enemy lines. When the ambush came, it was sudden, merciless, and precise. The night was filled with gunfire explosions and screams. She had tried to protect her team moving, faster than instinct would allow, yet even her training had limits. One by one, they fell, leaving her alone to carry the weight of failure across the broken terrain. She remembered the fear and the cold, the sting of metal and fire against flesh, and the quiet realization that she could not save everyone no matter how hard she tried. The memory made her flinch, and her lips tightened. The SEAL training here was nothing like that mission, but it was the closest she had allowed herself to come to, facing fear again in a controlled environment. The other trainees had no idea that every drill, every obstacle, every grueling exercise was a reflection of her own trial by fire. The scars they had glimpsed were just surface reminders of a reality, far more brutal that the mind could barely comprehend. The next morning, the instructors announced a new scenario: hostage extraction under simulated live fire. The recruits would be divided into teams and tasked with rescuing a team member from a fortified compound disguised as a derelict building on the edge of the training ground. The instructors promised it would be chaotic, loud, and dangerous, and many would fail. Some would be injured, but failure was expected and injury unavoidable. The others groaned, some visibly shaking with anxiety, but Reed packed her gear silently, her expression unreadable as she studied the map of the compound. The exercise began with gunfire, blanks piercing the air and alarms wailing. The recruits darted from cover to cover, shouting orders and responding to commands. Reed led her team with precision. She moved without hesitation, scouting the perimeter, checking corners, and signaling teammates with subtle gestures. Her knowledge of tactics and combat experience became evident to all as she guided them past traps and ambushes without a single mistake. One trainee whispered to another, "Are we sure she's even a candidate, or has she done this before?" Halfway through the simulation, a smoke grenade went off near her position, enveloping her team in thick white fog. The recruits panicked, coughing, choking, and losing their bearings, but Reed did not falter. She grabbed the nearest recruit, pulled him down, and dragged him behind a concrete barrier, her movements swift and sure. Her mind processed threats instantly, calculating paths of escape, angles of fire, and timing for each action as if she were replaying a memory etched into her instincts. Her team followed her lead blindly because they had no choice. The authority she exuded left no room for hesitation. When they reached the simulated hostages, Reed evaluated the situation, instantly deciding the best path of retreat. She whispered instructions into the comm unit, and even though her voice was calm, the urgency was palpable. She guided the team through a narrow corridor, avoiding obstacles and ensuring no one was left behind. The simulation ended with the team safely outside the compound, but the instructors were silent longer than usual, studying Reed with renewed attention. The other trainees stared at her, and for the first time realized that they had been in the hands of someone who had lived through the chaos they were only simulating. Back at the barracks, after the exercise, Reed went to the bathroom to clean the sweat and grime off her face. She caught her reflection in the mirror, and for a moment the mask of calm faded. Her eyes looked back at her with a haunted intensity that no one else would ever see. The scars across her body were visible in the dim light, and for a brief second she saw the girl she had been before the missions, the wounds, the loss, and the long nights of grief. She pressed her palm against the mirror and closed her eyes, remembering every life she could not save, every friend who had died beside her. Meanwhile, in the common area, the other recruits whispered and speculated about her past. Some dared to compare stories of heroics they had heard to the reality they now suspected. The rumors had spread like wildfire, and everyone was trying to piece together who she really was. Some claimed she had been a legendary operator in a black ops unit. Others whispered about missions that would be classified for decades. And then there were those too afraid to speak aloud who merely stared at her, silently acknowledging that Reed was no ordinary recruit and that her past would stop every SEAL cold if fully revealed. Late that night, a storm rolled in off the ocean lightning, illuminating the barracks and thunder shaking the walls. Reed lay awake, listening to the rain pounding against the roof. Each flash of lightning seemed to bring back memories in fragments, the screams, the chaos, the bitter taste of fear in the air, and the overwhelming responsibility of leadership in the face of impossible odds. She breathed slowly and allowed herself to remember, because holding it all inside was exhausting, and she knew that eventually The past would demand to be confronted. By everyone around her, by morning the storm had passed, leaving the ground slick with rain and debris. The instructors had set up another surprise exercise, a mock infiltration with multiple teams navigating overlapping objectives. The goal was to test adaptability, teamwork, and strategic thinking. Everyone was tense, nerves frayed and eyes darting constantly. But Reed approached the briefing silently absorbing every detail, calculating the risks and planning a path that others could only follow, blindly. The exercise began, and chaos erupted immediately. Teams collided at corners, simulated gunfire echoing across the training ground, and smoke grenades creating confusion. Reed moved like a shadow, weaving through danger, keeping her team coordinated and protected. She made split-second decisions with a clarity that stunned even the most seasoned instructors. Her past experience revealed itself in subtle gestures and commands that no one else could replicate. Every maneuver showed she was not just trained, she had survived and lived through real combat, and that survival had been forged in fire and blood. By the end of the day, her team emerged victorious, having completed all objectives with minimal errors. The other recruits were exhausted, broken and awestruck, while Reed appeared unscathed, as if nothing had occurred. Her silence remained absolute, and her composure untouched, but the fear and respect in the eyes of everyone who had watched her was unmistakable. They all knew without a doubt that the stories of her past were far more real than they could imagine, and that the day would come when they would finally understand why she was a force that stopped every SEAL cold. The following week, the training intensified beyond anything the recruits had anticipated. The instructors announced a new exercise, a night raid in complete darkness, with live tracking targets meant to simulate real enemy engagement. Every candidate was on edge, nerves, taut muscles, aching from exhaustion. But Reed moved through the briefing silently, listening to every word, memorizing every detail, while the others fidgeted and whispered. She adjusted her gear methodically, checking her weapon and communication devices. Her movements precise and calm, as if nothing in the world could shake her focus. When the night came, the compound was cloaked in shadows. The only light was the faint glow of distant moonlight reflecting off walls and the occasional flare fired by the instructors. The recruits advanced slowly, their senses heightened anxiety gripping them like chains, but Reed led with silent authority, guiding her team through the dark corridors of the mock building. Every step calculated, every movement anticipating threats before they materialized. It was not arrogance. It was instinct honed through experiences that none of the others could imagine. Halfway through the simulation, one of the recruits froze at a corner, hearing what he thought was movement behind him. He imagined shadows shifting and a noise that sounded like footsteps approaching. Panic seized him and he nearly fired on his own teammate, but Reed was there in a heartbeat, her hand on his shoulder steadying him, her eyes locked on the space. Ahead, her body a barrier between fear and chaos. She whispered directions into his ear and guided him past the corridor, teaching him without words that hesitation in combat could be deadly. That was the difference between a rookie and a veteran, between those who survive and those who do not. The team reached the simulated hostages and Reed took charge of the extraction. Her mind worked faster than anyone could comprehend, orchestrating cover points and escape routes while signaling teammates. With subtle gestures, her leadership was unspoken, yet absolute. The instructors watched with awe, noting that every move she made mirrored real combat scenarios, and yet there was no hesitation, no question of authority. The recruits followed because they had no choice. They trusted her instinctively. Though few understood why, in the middle of the operation, a smoke grenade was detonated, throwing the corridor into a cloud of choking gray. Reed felt her own lungs burn from the acrid smoke, but she did not falter. She reached for one recruit coughing violently, guided him to a safer position, and pressed a cloth over his mouth. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, and when the team emerged on the other side, she immediately assessed, injuries, giving quick commands for first aid while simultaneously coordinating the next step in their escape route. She moved like a phantom, weaving through the smoke, invisible yet commanding complete control. By the time the exercise ended, every recruit was exhausted, trembling and exhilarated at the same time. The instructors debriefed the teams, noting successes and failures, and Reed simply nodded, acknowledging instructions without comment. Her silence was louder than any praise, and her composure unnerving to the others. The rumor mill exploded that night with whispered stories in the barracks about the woman who had led them through chaos, unshaken and unafraid. The mystery of her past grew heavier with every retelling, and each recruit felt the weight of the truth they could sense, but did not yet know. Later that night, Reed sat alone on the edge of the cliffs, watching the waves crash against jagged rocks. Her mind drifted unbidden to the mission that had shaped her to become this way. The ambush, the screams, the loss of her team, the decision she had made to continue fighting alone. Despite the odds, every memory pressed against her mind like a relentless tide. She traced the scars along her arms, shoulders, and back, and felt the invisible wounds that ran deeper than flesh. The past had forged her into a weapon, into a leader, into someone no SEAL could underestimate. A knock on the door startled her. It was the lieutenant commander who had been observing her for weeks. He stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind him, and regarded her silently. His eyes studied every scar, every movement, as though trying to read the story she refused to tell. Finally, he spoke in a low, measured tone. "Reed, we need to talk. About your record." She did not respond. She simply gestured for him to sit and waited. His gaze softened slightly, but he did not avert his eyes. "You have survived things none of us can imagine. You have led teams through situations that would stop most seasoned operators cold. But your file is sealed, and we cannot ignore the past any longer." Reed exhaled slowly, a sound almost like a sigh, but silent enough that only she noticed. The past had always been a shadow looming over her every action, but now it was becoming a weight that others were beginning to sense. She nodded once, signaling that she understood without a word. The lieutenant commander leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The truth needs to be shared with your team. Soon the moment will come when they will need to understand the depths of your experience so they can trust you fully in missions that will test them in ways no training could replicate." The next day, the instructors arranged a briefing where Reed would reveal part of her past in controlled circumstances. She knew it was necessary, but the thought of exposing her history to the others made her uneasy because the memories carried the screams and the failures and the faces of friends who had died under her command. She walked into the room, her posture erect, her gaze unwavering, and every recruit felt the weight of anticipation heavy in the air. Some looked nervous, others curious, but no one spoke. The silence was absolute. She began slowly, recounting missions she had participated in, the operations that led to her injuries, the ambushes, the impossible choices, and the loss of teammates. The words were measured, precise, never indulging in drama, but the truth resonated in every ear, in every heart. The trainees felt the gravity of what she had endured, the reality of combat that was not simulated and not confined to training exercises. Each scar on her body told a story. Each silent gesture carried history that could no longer be ignored. By the end of her recounting, the room was still silent, but the energy had shifted. The fear, respect, and awe that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled quietly into realization. The recruits understood that Reed was not just another candidate. She was a veteran shaped by real battles, someone whose courage and resolve had been forged in fire and blood. The moment had come where every SEAL in the room understood why her presence commanded absolute attention, why hesitation around her was impossible, and why her silence had always been louder than words. Later, as she walked back to her quarters, the whispers started again, but this time they were different. They were full of admiration, respect, and a quiet understanding that she had survived horrors they could not imagine, and that her leadership was born not from training alone, but from the crucible of experience. She did not celebrate this recognition. She simply walked forward, aware that her past had finally claimed its place in the present, and that the final test for the recruits would come soon. That final test would not be one of endurance drills or obstacle courses. It would be real missions in which lives depended on trust, precision, and courage. And now that they knew even a fraction of her story, every recruit would have to confront their own limits and fears, knowing that Reed had already faced far greater challenges without flinching. The storm of training was far from over, and the horizon promised chaos and trials yet unseen. But one truth had settled in the hearts of everyone around her. Every SEAL stopped cold when faced with her combat past, and every trainee now knew that silence carried the power of experience, the weight of survival, and the authority of someone who had seen the edge of life and death and returned unbroken. The final exercise was unlike anything the recruits had faced before. It was a full-scale, simulated combat mission spanning land and sea with overlapping objectives and live tracking by the instructors. Everyone was tense, exhausted, and anxious, but Reed moved with calm precision, her mind calculating every possibility, every threat, and every move she would need to guide her team through the chaos as the mission began. Gunfire echoed across the compound. Simulated explosions rocked the ground and smoke filled the air. The trainees scattered, ducking behind cover, shouting orders and reacting to perceived threats. Reed led her team, silently guiding them through the maze of danger, anticipating traps and positioning them with instinctive authority. Every motion was flawless, every decision instant, and every command without words carried the weight of experience that none of the others could match. Halfway through the mission, a simulated casualty occurred, and panic threatened to take hold among the younger recruits. But Reed was there, pulling the injured to safety, instructing them calmly on how to move and react. Her hands were steady, her voice, even in the comms, precise and confident, and the team followed her lead instinctively, as if her presence alone made fear impossible. She moved like a shadow, weaving through chaos, ensuring no one was left behind, and that every objective was completed. The instructors watched silently amazed, noting how her experience and composure had turned a potential disaster into flawless execution. Her past had prepared her for this. She had lived through real chaos and loss, and every recruit now understood the depth of her resilience. The whispers from previous days returned, but this time they were reverent, full of understanding that she had faced more than any of them could imagine, and still led without hesitation or complaint. When the mission concluded, the team gathered, drenched, exhausted, and exhilarated, and Reed stood silently surveying her recruits. Her eyes carried the weight of her past, the ghosts of battles fought and the lives lost. Yet there was pride there, too, in the subtle acknowledgement that she had led them through the storm and emerged unbroken. The instructors debriefed the group, noting every success and every failure, but it was clear that the true lesson had come from watching Reed navigate the impossible in the quiet aftermath. The recruits reflected on what they had seen. Some felt awe, some fear, some deep respect, but all understood that the woman before them was more than a candidate. She was a survivor, a warrior forged in real combat, whose silence commanded attention and whose scars told a story words could never capture. The past that had once been hidden had now become a guide, a lesson, and a warning to all who followed. Reed walked away from the training,